So let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Andy Hawks, and I'm the coordinator of public programs and public engagement here at the Whitney. Closed captioning is available for this event, so if you'd like to enable the captioning feature, please click on the transcript option in the bar below. Tonight's lecture is being recorded in case you'd like to rewatch if you missed anything, so keep an eye out in your inbox tomorrow for a viewing link. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from the ancestral lands of the Lenape peoples, both past and present, otherwise known today as Manhattan. I'm thrilled to introduce the first session of our course this evening, Approaches to Abstraction, Women Artists, 1930 to 1950, which is organized in conjunction with the exhibition at the Whitney, Labyrinth of Forms, Women in Abstraction, 1930 to 1950. With 35 works by 26 artists drawn almost entirely from the Whitney's permanent collection, Labyrinth of Forms seeks to highlight the often overlooked achievements of women artists and explores the prominent role that they played in propelling the formal, technical, and conceptual evolution of abstract art in this country. The exhibition is on view now at the Whitney through March 13th, so I encourage you all to plan your visit to the museum if you haven't already. And with that being said, it is an honor to introduce our instructor for this evening, as well as the exhibition's curator, Sarah Humphreyville. Sarah Humphreyville is a senior curatorial assistant and has been part of the curatorial department here since 2013. And she's been part of the curatorial teams for Vida Americana, Mexican Muralist Remake America, 1925 to 1945, Agnes Pelton, Desert Transcendentalist, Grant Wood, American Gothic and Other Fables, among others. At the end of our program, we'll have a short Q&A, and I encourage you all to send us questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can click on the icon at the bottom of your screen and then type your question, and feel free to submit questions through the duration of the talk. We expect tonight's program will last until about 7 p.m. So without any else to say, I'd love to turn things over to our instructor, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome everyone. Andy did a really good job of introducing the show and also tonight's talk. They're really developed, together and inform one another. So just giving you a little bit of an installation shot here, hopefully to entice those of you who haven't yet had a chance to come to the museum a little bit to come before March 13th. So there's still just over 2 months to view this exhibition. So to set up a little bit, as Andy said, the show and tonight's talk are really delving into the contributions that American women made to the development of abstraction in this country, and doing so from a formal and technical and conceptual way. But to back up a little bit, I think, and to really understand the stakes of what's going on and what these artists' contributions are, I want to turn to a couple of works that might be a little bit surprising to see as the openers in a talk on this subject. John Stuart Curry's Baptism in Kansas and Edward Hopper's Early Sunday Morning, both of which are real hallmarks of the Whitney's collection. And for those of you with eagle eyes reading accession numbers, you'll be able to tell that they entered the Whitney's collection in 1931. So at our founding and really right at the time that this exhibition is picking up. And so I start with these really just to show what really was prevailing in American art in the early 1930s, and to put that up against just how radical a concept it was to be an abstract artist in this country, let alone to be a woman abstract artist in this country. Realism in its various guises and approaches really was the dominant thread of art making here, and museums and galleries largely ignored what American artists were doing in abstraction, and critics similarly really quite reviled abstraction being made in this country. So, while abstraction is maybe something that we take for granted now, it certainly wasn't in the 1930s. And then adding on to that, women who were practicing in this way were of course also entering a profession like so many others that was really dominated by men. And they had to contend with then these compounding layers of marginalization for being women, for being Americans, and for being abstractionists. And part of that was grappling with just everyday sexism and societal expectations. So there are a few strategies they had to, kind of work around this. Some of them chose to disguise their names as best they could when they were exhibiting. So you see on the left a detail of an Irene Pereira drawing that we'll see in full a little bit later, but you can see that, she just has her first name as the I, leaving off the Irene, kind of an attempt to make that gender a little bit more ambiguous. And there was really good reason for doing this. There are teachers that these women had who say things, like they're surprised when they see something they consider to be competent being done by a woman. And, critics express surprise when they learn that a gallery show or something like that they're visiting is done by a woman as well. And then on top of this, on top of being an artist, and of course, something that we're very much still dealing with even 90 years later, women really still had to kind of fulfill the expected roles in their home lives. So being wives and mothers, and we see on the right, the artist Alice Tremblemason with her daughter, Emily Mason, who would also come to be an artist just shortly after Emily is born. And I think Mason really summed it up really well, the kind of struggle that she had in having this dual function and this dual desire to both maintain her home life and the expectation that she really carry her home life, as well as being an artist. And in 1934, this is 4 years after she actually stopped her art making practice temporarily to focus on raising her children, she wrote to her sister and said, "Maybe you think intellectual life is not the real thing, but damn it, just caring for babies isn't either. I am chafing to get back to painting, and of course it's at least a couple of years away. The babies are adorable and terribly interesting. I'm not saying anything against them, but I don't want to. I just can't be absorbed in just them, even though they won't be babies for very long." So I think that's very telling of the struggle that not just she, but other artists of the period faced, and certainly in keeping with other things that were expressed by other artists at the time period. And I think this, this is something that we also see for artists who also are married to artist partners. So a number of artists in the show who we'll see tonight were in such a position, probably most famously Lee Krasner, who, in spite of now being a quite well-recognized artist in her own right, spent many years of her life really being known as Mrs. Jackson Pollock and working behind the scenes to forward his career even after his death. So all of that really begs the question of, how did abstraction come to flourish in the US during these 2 decades, and why was it that so many women were drawn to it? What's really provoking someone to take that plunge into such radical territory? And I think on the point of abstraction more broadly, women as well as men really saw it as a technique that was new. It was a new technique to express this new age that they were all living in with, kind of new technologies and urbanization, and abstraction therefore seemed like an appropriate tool. And then on top of that, for women, I think it really provides them with a sense of freedom that they didn't have in realism, that there wasn't really anything kind of gendered about abstraction at that point, the way that there was with realism and certain subjects being seen as being appropriate to women, like the painting of flowers or the painting of scenes of mother and children, for example. And Pearl Fine, one of the artists in the exhibition, who's later become known as one of the abstract expressionist artists, had this phrase of associating realism with having, quote, oppressive particularities. And that's really what she's getting at when she says that. The other things that start to happen to really stimulate the development of abstraction here are centered around being able to learn about what's going on in Europe in a more immediate way. So American artists had, of course, been going to Paris, going to Germany, Italy, London, for many, many years prior to the 1930s, but that of course required a certain amount of money and freedom in order to be able to do so. But by the late 1920s, there's a shift and artists are able to all of a sudden see this art in a regular way without leaving the country, particularly in New York. So part of that is happening because new cultural visual art spaces are opening that have this art on view. Among them are probably most famously MoMA, and you see on the right an installation shot of their inaugural exhibition, which featured work by Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh. And also notably founded by three women. MoMA opened in 1929. 1927 saw the opening of A.E. Gallatin's Gallery of Living Art at NYU. Gallatin was an artist as well as a patron, and this space was also really importantly in Greenwich Village, so in a neighborhood where a lot of the artists visited. He also kept really funny hours for the space, keeping it open until 10 p.m. sometimes so that artists could actually have the time to come see what was on view there. And then the third, less of a permanent space, but kind of presence in introducing this avant-garde art to American audiences is the Société Anonyme. And you see a show that they staged at the Brooklyn Museum in 1926. On the left, this was really one of their great big shows, but they staged smaller exhibitions. They also held lectures and published texts, and were really interested in getting the word out about modernism. And like MoMA, the Société Anonyme was founded by three people, all of them artists, Man Ray, Duchamp, and then most significantly, Catherine Dreyer, who is really best known in art history for her role in not just founding the group, but really being its primary driver and force, especially after that first year. And Dreyer wrote that she saw the, quote, urgent need in the art world for people to acquaint themselves with the latest movements in modern painting and sculpture. So really understanding that was vital for artists, for students, for critics, for curators, really the entire community. And Dreyer, though, in addition to being a patron, being a collector, being this, kind of all-around organizer, was also herself significantly an artist, as was A.E. Gallatin. And her contributions to art making are really overlooked in favor of her organizing. But as we can see in this print, she made some really beautiful and creative work. And she started making abstractions really quite early on, as early as 1918. And then by 1929, a couple things happened. She's starting to hit her mature stride in her art making, which I think partly is the result of her fortunes literally turning down with the Great Depression and the crash in 1929. She's still fine, but maybe didn't have the same financial flexibility that she had prior, but that gave her a renewed focus on her own practice. And in 1934, she embarked on this series of lithographs, 40 variations, of which this is one. And they're really kind of unusual approach to printmaking, something that we associate with reproduction and everything being the same. And that's true of the armature in this work. So the black that you see in the print is the same across the entire portfolio, but the variations part comes in the colors. And each of the 40 prints in the portfolio, the group of prints, is hand colored with primary colors. And so they're all slightly different from one another. So this is the example in the Whitney's collection, but as you look at others across the grouping, you'll see the reds and blues and yellows placed in different ways, or even in different sizes within that central shape. So it's a really, really creative approach to a work, and also does, I think, a really good job of just expressing the joy that she is feeling in art making. And she said that she was inspired by music as well as the experience of being a regatta and watching sailboats just kind of fly about across the water in the wind. But to the point of her creativity around printmaking, she really expanded the concept of the lithograph even further beyond these sheets of paper and these 40 prints. And within just a few years of her making it, there were dances that were staged inspired by the work. So her friend Ted Shawn choreographed a dance to it, and another friend, Jess Meeker, created a corresponding musical score. And you can see here a photograph of one of the performances that happened with these, including these, kind of great costumes that are also inspired by the print, as well as a blow up of it being in the background. And this is the second iteration of this dance being performed. The first was in 1936, and then this is in 1939 by the Carol Lynn Ballet. So returning to the circumstances that allowed abstraction to really blossom beginning in the 1930s, at the same time that these venues for avant-garde art are really opening, you also start to see an influx of teachers who are really teaching in a modernist way in New York art schools. So Arshil Gorky, who's very, very well-known artist, although wasn't quite yet at this point, is teaching at the Grand Central School of Art from 1926 to 1931. And then at the same time, he's also really making himself a kind of person in the hallways at the Art Students League, which was really the most prominent art school in the US at that time. And while he's doing that in a more social capacity, at the same time, the League is also bringing on teachers who are likewise teaching in a modernist vein. And between 1928 and 1932, Vaclav Vitlichil, who you see here on the left, Jan Matulka, and Hans Hofmann, who you see on the right, all come to start teaching at the Art Students League. And Hofmann famously would kind of spin out and create his own school, as he had in Munich prior to coming to the US, and set up a school in New York in 1934 and another in Provincetown in 1935. And artists are really coming in and out of these spaces. It's not a super formal educational system with degrees like we have now, but these are places where community kind of begins to get developed amongst these artists. And many of the artists in the show studied with these teachers, and so came to know what they were thinking about and teaching, as well as each other. So quite famously among Hofmann's students is Lee Krasner, whose work Still Life from 1938 we see here. Krasner had studied art in a number of different places around the city, but in 1937 signed up for Hofmann's classes. And one of the things that Hofmann was doing that was also taught by Vitlichil, who himself had studied with Hofmann, was really to promote the importance of negative space. And this is something that I think we really take as a given now, especially in art education, but it's a pretty popular, common idea even amongst those who haven't taken a whole plethora of studio courses. But it was really a novel concept in the US at the time. And as part of thinking about negative space, Hofmann's also promoting this idea of how things push and pull throughout space. I think we can really see that reflected in this drawing by Krasner, which is oil paint on paper. And so much of how the composition becomes alive isn't just how she's placing these colors down, but in how she's allowing that paper to really breathe and shine through and function as a compositional principle in its own right. And it's not like Hofmann's saying this is exactly how you make art, but he's providing her with the tools and a new kind of language in order to figure out something on her own terms. And it really is on her own terms that she's creating this work. This is a far more abstract piece than Hofmann himself was making in his work at the time. And I think, save for that title of Still Life, this really does appear as a sort of pure abstraction. And Krasner is among the artists who cites Hofmann's classes as being a place where she met other artists and formed friendships. But she was at this point in the late 1930s, already really, really well ingrained in the broader New York art community from her other educational experiences and just really from, kind of being a living, working person in that world. She was one of a number of artists in the show who was part of the Artists Union, and she met people through that. And she was also a participant in the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project, which likewise really brought people together, in many cases, people who didn't know each other prior. And the project also really had the effect of giving American artists, and I think particularly women, a sense of themselves as professionals, that they're now doing work that is being respected and paid for by the government, that they're really being understood as laborers, as workers, as contributors to the economy. And on top of that, significantly for women, they were paid the same amount as men for the same work, which, still a sort of radical concept. But all of these ways of coming together really starts to build the artistic community as a whole, and really brings the abstract artists, who are still like a small number within this broader art world, together, and gets them, kind of gets them talking about what they need as a group, and are, really starting to think collectively rather than as individuals. And one of the things they all, really agree on is that they need a forum to discuss their ideas, and coming together really, really helps that. But what they really need more than anything else is the opportunity to exhibit, which, they'd pretty much, as I said before, been shut out of museums and galleries. Even the Whitney, which was founded at the same time and dedicated to American art, really was showing the realist art, examples of which we started out with. And the new spaces for avant-garde occasionally showed an American artist or two, but usually not from the kind of generation that was just emerging, and typically not American artists. So that Venn diagram of American and abstraction really led to the exclusion from the available spaces. So the artists got together and formed a group that they called the American Abstract Artists in late 1936. And they decided as one of their main objectives that they would have at least one show annually. And, recognizing that there were so few of them and that the situation was pretty dire, they were founded with, quote, a liberal interpretation upon the word abstract. So unlike Europe, where you had people in really defined movements, sometimes with manifestos, or sometimes even former friends coming to blows on disagreements over aesthetic principles, US artists really were much more open to a whole realm of what abstraction could be. And I think part of that is that they're also receiving so much information about that from their academic settings, where people are trying out all different manners of work. And then in the venues that they're viewing art, they're seeing, decades worth of European art at the same time, and then figuring out what to take from it, what to make their own, and how to adapt these multiple abstract languages to an American idiom. So they come together and they have their inaugural show in April 1937, which you're seeing an installation shot of here. And women were participants in the show, just as they were involved in the very start from the group. About 25% of the founding membership of the AAA was women, and they were really treated in a pretty egalitarian way. They held leadership roles, they organized programs, and they also significantly wrote for the group's yearbooks once they started being published in 1938. So they're not just showing their work, but are really getting out into the public the theoretical ideas around abstraction and the way that people are thinking about it, really, paving the way for the American audience to start understanding what they're doing and accepting it. As part of the first show, they didn't have a yearbook together yet, but they still decided it was really important to kind of promote their ideas beyond the boundaries of the gallery walls. And the show was only up for 2 weeks. So it's a pretty short run in an office space, something that is akin to a pop-up in our contemporary terms. So in order to promote the show after its duration and beyond the walls of this space, they decided to create a portfolio. So 30 of the 39 founding artists contributed prints to the portfolio. And of the 9 female founding members, 7 of them created them. And you can see those prints installed in the gallery at the Whitney here. And one of the things that I think is so critical to this body of work, both for the show and in really understanding the aims of the American abstract artists at this time, is that you can see just how different their approaches are to work. So in looking at the work on the top left by Esther Slobodkina, you really see this, quite geometric, totally abstract shape, this real contrast between dark and the negative space, and just really kind of an economy of line, versus on the bottom right, the work by Ray Kaiser, which is, you can tell still grounded in figuration, even though it's an abstract approach to that subject matter. So it really shows the variety of the group and the openness of their thinking. So the show was largely greeted with negative reviews. Critics thought it was decorative, that it was derivative, that it was disconnected from reality, all of which were common charges against abstraction during this period. But in spite of that, the group really considered the show a success. They had about 1,500 people come to the show just during that 2-week run, and they also sold about 500 editions of that print portfolio. So really achieving that mission of making a little bit of money, but really getting the work and the word of abstraction out into the world. And importantly, it wasn't just the group members themselves who saw the show as being successful, but other artists as well. So it really became an impetus for other artists to join in the years that followed. Among those artists was Irene Pereira, whose signature we saw in detail a few minutes ago. And this is the full work that detail was taken from. And Pereira's joining, I think, is quite significant in telling just how much steam the group had really gathered and how much prestige they'd acquired within the community of artists. Pereira was actually quite a prominent figure at this time. She had her first solo show in New York in 1933 and continued to have exhibits throughout the decade. She received positive reviews for these shows. She also was a significant figure within the WPA. She had a job at its design laboratory, which was a little bit different than what we think of the WPA as being with its mural projects, but that really helped her connect with other prominent people in the cultural landscape, as well as to learn about all sorts of new technologies that were being developed that then would inform her art. And her role there also really led to prominent lectures and public speaking opportunities. And she actually at first was rejected from the group. They didn't think that her work prior to 1938, when they were just starting out, was abstract enough. But in drawings like this and other works created this year, we really see a significant shift in her work, where we're seeing just this arrangement of planes on top of one another. And there's no doubt at all that this work is abstract. And so she really shifts from making work that is based on machines, based on ships, looking abstract or getting there, to these works, which are inspired by oftentimes her scientific or philosophical readings and the relationship between time and space and light. And she would actually talk about how space-time was her medium. And in her paintings, she's also working with a variety of different materials, including glass, and really thinking about how light and paint planes penetrate with one another. And I think in this drawing, the different kinds of marks that she's making, as well as the layering, really show off the way that she's thinking about form. Charmian Bonvan was also a later addition to the group. She started making abstractions in the early 1940s with these automatic drawings. So an exercise taken from the surrealists, where you'd look up and have your pen down on your paper and not look at what you were doing. And she'd make hundreds of these drawings and then select just a few for further development, filling them in with color and adding in collaged elements. So those passages of pattern that you can see in the images are, little scraps of wrapping paper and things like that that she collected and then would incorporate into her work. But Van Wiegen significantly wasn't just an artist. She was also a writer. She'd actually gone to journalism school. She had worked for Hearst in their Moscow office, and really had a broad cultural grounding as well. And she was the sole critic who, before her membership in the group, gave that inaugural American Abstract Artist show a positive review. She really was the person who sought to understand that work on its own terms and to try to figure out what the artists were doing. And through that piece, as well as her other writing, she really kind of opened up the discourse for American audiences to start understanding abstraction a little bit better. And that, in conjunction with shows that she organized, as well as the annual shows that the American abstract artists were doing, really led to a growing acceptance of abstraction in the 1940s. And even critics that had been kind of hostile, or totally hostile to it before, were acknowledging that, maybe it wasn't quite their thing, but at least it was something that was worth acknowledging and that needed to be engaged with. So the lead critic for the New York Times, for instance, said that abstraction wasn't just a flash in the pan, that it was here to stay. And younger critics also start their careers at this point and are more open to engaging with the material as well. At the same time, the late 30s and early 40s, like the late 20s, also start to see even more spaces that are receptive to abstraction and to American abstraction, crucially, open up. So the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which becomes the Guggenheim, opens. You've also got the Nierendorf Gallery, the Pinoteca, the Willard Gallery, Betty Parsons, probably the best known name now, Wittenborn and Schultz, which was an important venue in particular for printmaking to be shown. So especially critical for this topic tonight. And also Art of this Century, which was Peggy Guggenheim's space in New York. And you can see here an installation at Art of this Century. This is one of the galleries devoted to abstraction that artists, again, had regular access to, as well as the opportunity to actually show in now. And crucially for the women in this show, Guggenheim had two shows, one in 1943 and one in 1945, that were dedicated just to women working in abstraction and surrealism. But the sort of ironic thing for the American abstract artists is that as these spaces are opening, as the art world is maybe becoming more receptive to abstract art in general, their influence really begins to wane. So part of that, I think, is actually because all of these places are opening, there may be maybe some more opportunity, and some of the artists that remain in the AAA kind of really dig down into the idea that, the kind of true abstraction is this kind of cool geometric abstraction, and that's really the style that we come to associate that with them now, but we did see, of course, just how varied it was at the beginning. But that attitude really alienates some of the members and leads to people dropping out of the group. And then on top of that, you also have an influx of European artists with the outbreak of World War II coming to New York, particularly the Surrealists. So that also really starts to change the social dynamic in New York, which is, of course, also very bound up with the artistic dynamic as well. But in spite of the presence of the Surrealists and the kind of growing contingent of Americans working in that vein, and the kind of particular attitude of the most vocal members of the AAA, the larger community of American abstract artists really retains their commitment to having an experimental, open approach to abstraction, with people exploring a whole array of styles and techniques in the 1940s. And there are still spaces, of course, where these artists come together and form communities beyond just the social context. And one of the places where this sort of mutually supportive group really developed was at the Atelier 17 print studio. And you see on the screen a couple of action shots of artists at work at the print shop. So Atelier 17 was a print shop founded originally in Paris in the late 1920s that like artists with the outbreak of World War II came to New York in 1940. It was founded by the British artist Stanley William Hayter, and he really believed that printmaking could be a vital tool for the development of modern art. And the studio, as a result, really became a laboratory for both formal and technical experimentation. And it's through that joining of materials and process, as well as aesthetic ideas, that he really brings the idea of modern printmaking to the United States. And the shop specializes in intaglio printmaking, which we see people doing here, and will be a good thing to keep in mind for our session next week, when we kind of delve into printmaking techniques with a bit more detail. But for now, suffice it to say that the studio specialized in this method, and they, as part of that, they also really broadened the use of soft ground printing, which we'll talk about a little bit more, as well as new approaches to color printing and the sculptural applications of embossing. And a couple more action shots here. So Sue Fuller, who was one of the artists working there, likened this endeavor and the print shop to being the cell of a revolution. And in this space, you had a confluence of emerging American artists working right alongside really well-established European figures without there really being a hierarchy between them. And the ethos of the shop was really that collaboration and idea sharing were guiding principles. Nobody owned one particular way of working or method or anything like that. And women, who actually comprised about 40% of the artists working at the print shop in New York, were really regarded as important contributors. And they were, participants in the aesthetic debates that happened there. They participated in the exhibitions, really crucially, and their involvement with the shop, the relationships they made there, as well as these exhibition opportunities, really helped them establish their professional reputations as serious artists in a way that would have been quite difficult for them to do with what else was available to them in the art world at the time. So among the artists working at Atelier 17 was Alice Tremblemason, and we see here on the left her pulling a print a few years later, actually not at Atelier 17, in her home studio, I believe. But she had, she kind of dabbled in prints a little bit before, but made her first print at the studio in 1945. Of the works made in that year, Labyrinth of Forms on the right, of course, lends itself to inspiring the exhibition's title. But from this point in 1945 on, printmaking really becomes an important part of her practice. She works in intaglio and she works in woodcut, and continues to do so really almost for the rest of her life, when she died in 1971. And printmaking and painting were both vital for what she was doing, but printmaking in particular really gave her the opportunity to exhibit not just in New York, but all around the country. And she had much more success in showing these works versus her paintings. So they really helped establish her career. One of the other things I want to highlight about Mason that you can see in the exhibition is that over the course of these decades and through their work in drawings and in prints, these artists are not just necessarily sticking with one style. So that idea of experimentation, of variety within abstraction, is not just from artist to artist, but oftentimes within an individual artist's practice. So we see here on the left the contribution that she made to the American Abstract Artists portfolio, then Labyrinth of Forms in the center, and then March Time, another Atelier 17 print on the right. And so we just, we can kind of see her development and the different ideas that she has over the course of these 2 decades in these 3 works. Another prominent figure at Atelier 17 was Sue Fuller, who I mentioned by quoting her talking about the print shop as the cell of a revolution just a few minutes ago. And Fuller was really at the forefront of this revolution. She was, for starters, a really prominent female figure there. She served as a studio monitor and a master printer. The master printer was typically a function that had been reserved for men, but she was there and helping, these really prominent European artists print their work. And she was also at the forefront of some of the technical innovations that the studio was doing. So in one great example, she really single-handedly revived the technique of sugar lift etching, which is an approach that really lets you get a kind of painterly mark into a print, an intaglio print at that, which is quite difficult to do. And she accomplished this through a lot of art historical research, but also experiments in her kitchen with Caro corn syrup. And in all of the work that she made at Atelier 17, she's really combining that, kind of inherent ingenuity that she has with other material discoveries that the studio is making. And so we see that in this work, Lancelot and Guinevere, which is among other techniques that are happening here. And we will dive into this work in particular next week. But one of the things that she's doing is really kind of stretching at the boundaries of what soft ground printing can be. So in that approach, it has a softer ground, a more malleable surface in which to make marks into a copper plate. And what she would do for it is to use fabric. And so we see here these strings and laces. But as she developed her process and way of working, Fuller really wanted to have control over it. So she started building these systems for putting down these fibrous materials, which you can see on the left, creating these collages across wooden frames with string and ribbon and lace, and then using that to press into her plate. And then we see on the right, if you think of it as a mirror image and then turn it upside down, the print that results from this collaged version of Sailor's Dream. And then by 1945, Fuller actually became so taken with this approach of making a print that she actually evolved them into these sculptures that she called string compositions. So you can see this thread, so to speak, in her practice of how her printmaking directly informed the work that she would become known for later in her career. And these are just two examples of those works that are in the Whitney's holdings. So we mostly have talked about artists that are based in New York thus far, but there was also a number of artists in California who were interested in abstraction and pushing at the boundaries there, including Barbara Olmsted. Olmsted actually had also worked at Atelier 17, but at its Paris iteration in the late 1930s, and printmaking became an important part of her practice from that point on. She mostly worked in lithographs when she was back in the US and was based in San Francisco. And this work, Memory of the Dark, is one of them. And this work was featured in exhibitions at the time. It actually won the top prize at the San Francisco Museum's annual, was printed on their catalog cover, but Olmsted is really not well known at all today. She really had a quite short career of just 7 years, abandoning her artistic career when she married her second husband in favor of joining him, becoming an olives orchard farmer shortly after that. And that's something too that I think we see of the women in this period, that sometimes they're making really great work, but because of other life circumstances intervening, they have these careers that are just a handful of years long. Continuing on the topic of lithography, there was a really vital workshop in that medium in Los Angeles, run by Linton Kistler, who had been a commercial lithographer, but decided that the medium would be really great to adapt to fine art. So lithography now is, of course, a very prominent artistic medium, but at the time really was associated with commercial practice. But he kind of started it out as a hobby, having people produce prints with him on the weekends in his garage, among them Elise, who we see on the right, who, in addition to being an artist, was also an actress, which brought her out to Los Angeles. But she's really among the first people that are making non-objective or abstractions that are based, totally on form, not on objects in the real world in her work, which we see in Untitled Abstract Ovoids and Lines. And then probably most famously, June Wayne also comes to work with Kistler at his shop and convinces him to rent her lithography stones so she can actually work at home as well, and really learns the medium through him and working on her own together to make these works like Black Ball in a Room that, similar to what Pereira is thinking about, are about the relationship between time and space and light. She was inspired by driving through tunnels on LA's freeways, which and seeing cars come in the opposite direction and how the light would change. But notably through this work in lithography, Wayne really becomes one of the people at the forefront of that printmaking method as a fine art technique, and goes on to found the Tamarind Workshop, which becomes one of the most prominent places where lithographs are made in subsequent decades, really part of the printmaking renaissance. So we see her kind of beginning to start out here before carrying on the next chapter of printmaking. So similarly, screen printing was also kind of being transformed from a commercial art form into one that could be readily accepted within the fine art world. And Dora Bothwell, another artist based in the Bay Area, was really at the forefront of that, and taught herself how to create screen prints after seeing a fine art exhibition of screen prints in 1943, and then really remained dedicated to that medium, in spite people really mocking her for trying to use it to make art from 1943 on. And as she describes her dedication to it and her approach to learning about it, she said, "I was on the cutting edge. At one point, I was the only woman in Northern California doing this. This fits with myself in being an innovative person." And I think with that quote in mind, and having seen so many innovative people on screen tonight, I'll conclude my remarks and open it up for questions if Andy wants to join me back on the screen to moderate that, and I'll stop the share too.
Hi, thank you so much for such an informative and amazing lecture. Thank you so much for that. And we've gotten a lot of fantastic questions from a lot of interested people. So I'm going to do a little bit of synthesizing. If the question is verbatim, I'm going to say that. But we've gotten a lot of questions about the influence. So I'll just sort of speak directly to the Dreyer lithographs. There's a lot of questions about animation and the influence that motion pictures might have had on some of these works, because they do look as if they're looking at cartoons. Or if you could speak a little bit about what, if animation had an influence on abstract art in America.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of simultaneous activity happening, but I think I would describe it, more with that adjective in mind, rather than as either one having a direct sort of influence on one another. So I think, of course, artists were aware of films. Elise herself was in them, that actually prompted her move to LA. But Dreyer in particular really was embedded within the visual art world, and very, very aware, of kind of everything happening in European avant-garde art. So and those are much more important sources for her than animation or would have been. But I can see in that one in particular that they really do have this feeling of an animation cell. I think particularly with how she sketches out the boundary of her workspace within the sheet, that it has that feel. And yeah, I understand the impulse there.
Yeah, seeing it on the stage was I could see it as a motion picture. So one of the questions that I think that you answered in your lecture, but maybe just to have you hammer out a little bit more, is why do you think women were, or women artists in particular, were drawn to printmaking or works on paper more so than their male counterparts, or were they?
I don't think it's necessarily more than their male counterparts, but I do think that printmaking, especially like abstraction in a broader way, gives them a little bit more of the freedom than working in other media might have. Some of the freedom, and I didn't really talk about this, though I do get into this in the show's accompanying essay, which is on the Whitney's website. Part of the freedom that these artists have in abstraction is that nobody's paying attention to it. So that's terrible on the one hand, and has this whole dearth of exhibition opportunities and financial support as a result of it. But it does really let people kind of focus in on what they want to do. And I think that the lack of market support is part of the reason that you get so many divergent styles in abstraction, and that printmaking too also basically had no market, or there's no market for modern prints at the time either. So there's very little competition there. And I think that lack of competition really gave space to the women within the movement. And that, one of the shifts we start to have happen in the mid 40s, but I think it's really by 1950, where you've got another wave of galleries that are opening that are realizing that there are new American collectors who are interested in collecting American abstract art, and you start to kind of have a little bit more of a solidification around the idea of abstract expressionism, and people becoming really vested in that as a movement, but also as something that's marketable. And that kind of cohesion in the market, I think, actually leads to women being pushed out, or at least push the margins, and that has an effect not just on people working at the time, but also how the art history is written, and is a large part of the reason why we're still working on recovering these reputations and these artworks. And I think, as part of that, it's not just women and what they made, but that we also really need to really bring printmaking more into the fold of how abstraction and modernism more broadly dedicated, or how that contributed to the development of both of those things in this country in particular.
Thank you. One of the questions that also came up, and I'm going to synthesize a little bit, but it did come from Joanne, was about nightlife, and specifically sort of like the social aspect of art. And specifically, were women excluded from congregating in like sort of one of the places, Cedar Tavern in Greenwich Village in later decades? Did the social aspects of the art world sort of slowly elude women, or were they present in those spaces as well?
So that's another place where you do start to see this shift in the late 40s and the early 50s. In the 30s and early 40s, women were definitely part of the socializing that was going on. When the Surrealists came to New York, they were a pretty macho group, and held events kind of at people's apartments, or other places where all the male artists would get together and talk, and they would specifically exclude they didn't even refer to them as women artists, they just called them the wives. And so Pollock is invited to come to these, but Lee Krasner is not. And Krasner is arguably the more established artist or person within the art world at that point. Pollock didn't really like that group, but that was certainly a factor. And then the women were not, on the whole, as much into the drinking culture. And Cedar Tavern, I think, is kind of a notoriously difficult place to be as a woman. So you may not have been formally excluded from it. You may have been allowed in the space, but whether or not that made for a comfortable time is another question. I think people are treated much more as objects than as women artists within that space, from the accounts that I've seen. And I think, the other place to really, or group to really talk about within that context is the club, which did come to include women artists. And at some point later, people even said, none of us would be here without Alice Tremblemason. But when the club started out, it actually was originally intended just to be for men. It changed pretty quickly. But, if that's the idea that you're found with, I think that obviously has some lingering effects.
Well, thank you. There's another sort of set of questions about names that are really familiar household names that weren't mentioned. So this isn't so much of a question, but where did Helen Frankenthaler fit? Where did Annie Albers fit? Did Black Mountain College play any role in this? Those are some of the highlight questions that I've sort of gotten.
Yeah, so Frankenthaler is really kind of like the next half generation from this. So she's some of the names that I mentioned tonight, Krasner and Pearl Fine, for instance, are associated with abstract expressionism now, but nobody knew what abstract expressionism was at this point. And by the time Frankenthaler's really getting involved, and Joan Mitchell would fall into this category too, the things are a little bit more established. So, you kind of get into this division of first generation, second generation, whatever that means. But they were not really actively making work in the 30s and early 40s that were part of the conversation in this way. And then with regard to Black Mountain College, it's also kind of getting rolling, in the late 40s, really influencing that group of artists that's kind of emerging in large part in the 50s. Although, one person who I would point out as being an important exception to that is Elaine de Kooning, who I did not mention, but is included in the show with a drawing that she made like just prior to going to Black Mountain. So that's again a kind of half step, and Annie Albers is of course also involved in that Black Mountain conversation, as well as the Tamarind workshop, which I did mention, but she too is also kind of coming in a little bit later. She's in Europe before that point. So
great. Well, I want to be really mindful of time, so there are just a few more questions, I guess. Do you want a quick fun one, or would you want one that's a little more? I'll give you a quick fun.
You're moderating. It's up to you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is a quick fun one. Joanne asks, at what point did Pereira out herself as a woman? When did she change? Start using her full name? Did she ever appear at openings? Like, when did it end?
Yeah, I mean, she was never like in hibernation, like trying to not show who she was, but it was also definitely a little bit easier perhaps to sell if the work and the show title was under Iris Pereira. And that's pretty much how she exhibited. I mean, people would talk about her at the time in reviews or even in catalog essays, Iris Pereira, like also known as Irene, that wasn't a secret. And she actually in person, in her public persona, was quite overtly feminine, and actually there's like press about her in her Balenciaga dresses and stuff like that. And she kind of talks about how like fabulous it is to be able to get dressed up and explore that too. So she certainly wasn't hiding it, and really none of the artists in the show were Dora Bothwell, who we ended on. Her birth name is Doris, but early on in her career in the 20s, she's talking to other women artists and is like, why am I not getting picked for these juried shows? And they're like, well, because you're showing as Doris. And so she changed her name, and it wasn't necessarily to like totally mask who she was, but to, just kind of take the edge off and subvert things just a little bit. So we probably have time for the one more. Yeah,
well, this is a meaty one. So Larry asks, obviously this all sort of happens before the war. Did the United States entry into World War II, it obviously impacted a lot about women's lives. Did it have a definable impact on the lives and the work of women artists of this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, obviously depends on who the artist is, and certainly the artist's involvement with World War II actually, precedes the US's entry into the war. So a number of the artists were involved with the American Artists Congress and the artists unions, kind of tangential to that, but are really interested in, how do you use art to combat fascism? What is the role of an artist within that? I mean, that was one of the challenges for the artists of this period too. And that when people were charging abstraction in general with being disconnected from reality, that's often what they meant, that it wasn't divorced from the politics and the pressing social issues of the era, which, the abstract artists didn't, some of them felt like it wasn't, some of them felt like, art was kind of its own separate thing. But, other artists in the show, one of whom we'll talk about next week, Terry Haas, came to the US as an immigrant fleeing the Nazis. Hedda Stern, who's also in the exhibition, also came to the US because of the war. And then one of the, this is a great story, so maybe it's a little fun one to end on. And I had mentioned in the context of Barbara Olmsted that, some of these artists had shorter careers because life intervened. And in Olmsted's case, it was, kind of abandoning her artistic career for her new marriage and her husband's profession. But one that is just really intriguing to me, and I'm dying to know more about her, even though there's very little out there, is one of the female founders of the AAA, Agnes Lyall, who had one of the prints in the portfolio, but from what we can tell, gave up her artistic ambitions in order to work for the OSS, so the CIA's predecessor. She's apparently very adept at languages and learned Japanese and was able to translate on behalf of the US in that capacity. So in her case, the war really kind of put an end to her artistic career. But so yeah, that's kind of a roundabout answer with a lot of different tangents to it, but hopefully satisfies the questioner a little bit.
I think it does. Well, we're at 7:02, so I want to thank you so much for this fantastic lecture. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight and encourage you all to join us next week, January 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our second session. We'll be joined by Clara Rojas Sebesta, the Ellsworth Kelly Conservator of Paper at the Whitney, and we'll be looking at some really interesting works in the exhibition. And yeah, so thank you and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.